Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's town hall. I am hopeful that Pastor Anders will be joining us shortly. They're just joining us from another meeting. Hello, everyone. And while we wait, I will remind you of some of the ways that you can add questions and comments to the page. If you are joining us via Zoom webinar, you can type in questions in the Q&A portion. Feel free to put any comments that you want to share with each other in the chat portion. And remember that hopefully Anders will successfully join us in this space. If you are watching live on Facebook, then you can add any questions directly to the comment stream on the video, or you can use hashtag Lutherans Listen, and you should be able to join in that way. We have over the series, hooray, Pastor Anders is here, and we'll give him just a second to tune in. We have over the series of town halls, as we have been listening to each other, we have taken the time to listen to individuals who have heard about bias in the Lutheran Church. We've listened to the Latinx community. We have listened to Black Lutherans. We have listened to folk about aging. We have listened about disability issues. We have listened to folk who are LGBTQIA. We have listened to people with diverse genders. And as a part of this conversation, we have collected some of the ways that bias exists in congregations. We've also been collecting feedback via surveys of what people are interested in learning about. Last week's presentation with Judith Dancer on what aging is like in congregations was one of those times. And today's presentation with Anders comes directly out of the survey feedback as well, because you might think in a conversation about bias, why Anders? Why Middle Church? But we have specifically had questions about what younger communities are up to and how people can respond to folk who identify as spiritual but not religious. And so Pastor Anders, who is at St. Cyprian's Episcopal Church right now, I believe is the location that you are at, is now joining us. Anders, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually coming from Resurrection Lutheran Church in Oakland today.
I don't know why I didn't just recognize it. Looks very similar with the ceiling roof beams there.
Yeah, it does look similar. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Anders Peterson. I live in Oakland, and I helped to kind of co-found, along with a bunch of lay leaders, a community that is called Middle Circle, and I'm happy to tell you more about what that means and how it's all connected to bias, but in the Lutheran Church. But I'm a ordained minister in the ELCA. I was a student at the GTU, with my homeschool being PLTS. I originally hail from the suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where my parents still live. And I've resided in Oakland since I came to the Bay Area to go to school, graduate school, more than about 10 years ago.
That's awesome. And you, my recollection as a pastor who was kind of nearby as you were kind of formulating kind of your vision of ministry, are someone who had this really deep call to folk who were, I don't know if we would call them on the edges of the church, but folk who were longing for what church had to offer, but maybe expressed it differently than folk who were in typical congregational settings with, traditional building styles like you're sitting in, and who kind of just thought of themselves organizing in unique ways. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your vision of what ministry can be.
Sure. So I think some of it helps by telling a little bit of my story. I grew up kind of in a cradle Lutheran situation. I have a family members who've been part of the church and work in the church councils in Minnesota, and I grew up singing in the boys' choir at church, and went to confirmation, and eventually went to a ELCA undergraduate school, Gustavus Adolphus College, and I studied religion in college. And it was there that I learned that a lot of the stuff I was raised to believe was not true regarding Christianity, Jesus. It took me to Israel, where I studied abroad there, and I learned about the historical Jesus. And a lot of my peers also came from those backgrounds. And I think one thing that I learned was that there was a lot of kind of expectation in the church life that we grew up in, that once you became more aware of the world and critical thinking, I think was a big part of it. There was a realization that everything that the church was kind of standing for and even telling you to believe wasn't necessarily things that you, as a critical thinker, wanted to believe anymore. And so it turned out that a lot of my peers after college started to choose to think about their faith differently. And so this is my long way of saying that in a nutshell, what I realized was many of my peers who came from backgrounds like me, perhaps children of churchgoers of the boomers, no longer really felt a need or interest in participating in church life as former generations had wanted to. And so my interest was like, well, what is going to happen with this group of people? Because this is a big group of people who now look at faith and connectivity to the church differently than they do today. And where are they going to participate or belong in the church? So that has always been my passion, is kind of, if they're not going to participate in the formal life of the church, do you then just say goodbye to them and not try to share in life with them? Or do you try to go outside of the traditional church structure to then go and be in life and shared life together with that audience? And at the time, 10, 15 years ago, this was like kind of like a new thought, a new idea. But now, now it's people have been able to share their affiliation as none, meaning no religious preference, and it's no longer kind of societally perceived as I don't know, something that you might keep hidden because you want to be accepted in society. You don't have to belong to a church to be perceived as a person who means well and has strong values. But it used to be you oftentimes needed to belong to something to show that you were participating in the norms of society. So
yeah, I think I felt kind of just slightly to the edge of that cusp of kind of pastoral community, because I think there's something about growing up and doing ministry in the age of the internet being a really profound thing. Like, it used to be you had to have access to the old dusty books to study what ancient theologians believe. And now you can watch videos of people doing yoga in India live streamed, right? And so people can choose to be a part of different things that might have in the past been thought of as only Buddhist or only Hindu. And now I think when I first became a pastor, there was this big breakthrough. There was a bishop who was into stretching. They couldn't call it yoga. They called it faithful stretching, and they would incorporate the Psalms into it, right? And I think now there's more of an acceptance that you can do things, you can be enriched by things of other faith communities and not necessarily be an unfaithful person. And I think this part of the reason I was so excited that you would come and talk in this space in particular is I think I hear a lot that folk who don't identify with a particular religious belief are unfaithful. Sometimes people call them unfaithful people. And I perceive this group of people as very faithful. Some of them have faith in science, some of them have faith in family, some of them have faith in communal principles, some of them have faith in political ties that they have, some of them have faith in their whatever it is that they're having faith in. They might not believe in all of the things you have to promise to believe in to be baptized as an adult, right? Or to take ordination vows, but they might believe in some of them. And I appreciate that instead of just saying, well, if you don't have faith, you don't need a pastor, right? Because in the old days, they would just draw a line on a map and say, everyone who lives in this area deserves a pastor and gets a pastor, and help them with what their faith is. And maybe they'll come to your church, but you're still kind of a pastor for them. And you see yourself as a chaplain or as a person of faith who's called to people who on paper might be declared unfaithful by other people. And I think that could really change people's perception about, you know, because I hear it a lot. How do we live our faith amongst all of this unfaithful generation? And I think you just don't see the world that way. And so would you be willing to kind of talk about how, like, what middle circle is? And feel free to take a long time because I think it has developed over time. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
And actually, if you think, so Lutherans in general on this topic hold a lot of bias that I think they're not willing to confront. And a lot of this has to do with, even like the term of microaggressions or things like that, where we would typically think of those things as focused on sexism or racism, and that there can be microaggressions against people of different religious perspectives, but also no religious perspective. And one of the terms that I was going to encourage people to think about not using anymore is the word unchurched, which was a really common phrase that our church, the ELCA, has used in its kind of circle of conversation around people who are not participating in the life of the church. And if you think of just anything, you know, and Megan, as you were sharing about being unfaithful, you know, it can make someone feel like they're missing something. And if the perception is that if only you were in church, how much better of a person you'd be, you know, because you're not in church, you're unchurched, you're not whole, you're not beloved, you're not engaged in the community in the way that we, the people in the church, are. And what has turned out is a perspective that kind of perpetuates Lutherans as needing to still get that people outside of traditional church life are happy people, they're thriving people, they're good people, they're values-based people. Now, the thing that's interesting is that people who were raised in the church sometimes don't think of the reason why they are happy, flourishing, values-driven, justice-oriented, caring people is perhaps in part because of the life that they had in the church. But now they don't believe certain things. And so then the perspective is that everything that they believed has been put aside, but that's just not true. You know, so we have lots of conversations about everybody's backgrounds, general with the church, and you find that most people who participate in Middle Circle would be happy to talk about their engagement with organized religion. So Middle Circle, it should be named that Middle Circle had a almost like a restart out of a former vision which I still think is a great vision. I believe in some respects it's a vision that Megan is trying to unfold in the work of her congregation, but it's basically that your church building should be seen as a place of welcome for people in a variety of ways, not just for getting together for worship. But if you think about this building and what it was designed for, when they designed this, it was primarily for people to come and use on a Sunday morning and sit in this pew and listen and look at this altar. And that should this space be also utilized for other things, like if it's a big space and people in the community would likely be interested in using it and being engaged in this space if it was more accessible to them. So originally we had a dream in San Francisco, along with some other people in the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church, to work on helping to activate a church space for the neighborhood and the Western Addition community near USF, and to make it a community center that also is a church for congregations. And that worked and was thriving. The challenges came because we were a church of many congregations with many different perspectives of what our ultimate goals should be.
And you're also navigating like Episcopal Lutheran dynamics, right?
Yes. Yeah. And the polity there is quite different, and structures of power, of who holds power. And what happened was the lay community in the neighborhood was thriving, and it caused the church itself to feel like the power that they held was kind of being taken away from them, when in fact I think what the community wanted to do was to empower the church. But I think that some of that bias and what is the purpose? Does someone belong to this place if they don't come on a Sunday morning?
Yeah, and what concentration of secular people is too much to dilute the holy that exists in the place? And can it is it a holy place because it's a holy place, or does too much secular dilute that? That's, I think, the dynamic.
Yes, and even that the spectrum of people who would be perceived as secular or spiritual, but maybe not spiritual conforming to the spirituality of the congregations, and that there can be some challenge in that. So what we decided to do was to form a separate entity for a container, really, an organizational container for that group, because they were kind of just a part of this center. And there needed to be a place of belonging, even if it's just in name, for this community. And so that is how Middle Circle came to be. And it came to be through design thinking, and specifically human-centered design thinking. So what I did was I just gathered people who held interest in almost like a common need, but we weren't sure what the need was. And it was kind of wanting to belong to something, but not wanting that place of belonging to be blankety blank Lutheran Church, because those people didn't identify as Lutheran. And the people who gathered included people who identified as spiritual, not religious, people who identified as ELCA Lutherans, people who identified as Episcopalian, identified as Jewish, as Muslim, as Buddhist, and we gathered this group of designers together, and we met weekly to ask ourselves what it is that we were trying to create. And ultimately, the question that we formed as our as the what we would try to answer in designing was, how do we create church-like community in progressive urban areas? How do we create church-like community in progressive urban areas? And we sat and talked about a lot putting church in there, in the question, the core question. And what was fascinating was it was the non-churchy folk, the people who did not grow up in the church, who wanted that included in the question. Jewish people and secular people. And the reason being that when they thought of church, they thought of that warm, connected community, of caring community, that they wanted that and felt like they were missing that in their life. And the churchy people, me included, were like, aren't we trying to create something that's not church? I mean, isn't that the point? And they'd say, well, yeah, but we like church. And I'd say, but I thought we didn't like church. What are we talking about here? So it was kind of confusing at first. And then we realized that this thing that we were speaking of, this desire of a community, and not just a motorcycle community or a biking community or a ultimate frisbee community, but a place of knowing and belonging and vulnerability and co-creating the world that we dream of, and a place where you could be challenged, all those kinds of things. We were trying to figure out, well, what is that? And we read a book. Some of us read a book. It was pretty dry, by an author, Mark Dunkelman, and it's called The Vanishing Neighbor. And in that book, he spoke of the township, the original township that occurred in basically the expansion of the people coming and living in what is now the U.S., and that people lived in these kind of family units, but then there was a township where they would gather together and share resources and share in life together. And the township then kind of became the neighborhood. And then at some point we lost track of that you would feel connected in a type of community. It kind of went to churches or organized church life or faith life. And then as people started not participating in those kinds of ways of being in community, what we found is that there was this tremendous loss of a particular form of community. And how Mark Dunkelman described this was through rings. So you had the inner ring, the middle ring, and the outer ring. And what was vanishing, the vanishing neighbor, is the vanishing middle ring. And so the epiphany was there, that what we were talking about was this middle form of community that people are not getting anymore. And for obvious reasons, we thought it was not wise to probably call the community middle ring. So we started using the term circles just to talk about this sociological idea of the middle circle. And as we talked more and more about it, we realized that we should just call the community the thing that we're trying to create, which is middle circle community. And what's fascinating is that that's really what the church, if you ask people why they come to church or belong to a church, oftentimes you find the response is because of the ability to feel like they belong to a middle circle. The way to define the middle circle would be, it's distinctly the type of community that is not your inner circle. Your inner circle would be your closest people in your life, family, close friends. I oftentimes say it's oftentimes the people that you love but don't necessarily like. It's the people that you are bonded to. I have friends that I went to high school with, I'm still connected to closely. We don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything today, but I still love them and care about them. They're going to be in my inner circle forever. And then you have an outer circle, and that would be defined as loose acquaintances. People like, let's say it's your hairdresser whose name maybe that they have children or roughly their background, but you don't know them. you don't know them deeply. You're not going to have them over for Thanksgiving dinner, perhaps. And so the middle circle would be a place of belonging where you have usually some sort of core way of gathering, like a social contract or a covenant that makes the community gather in a particular way. And the people who belong there care about you and you care about them, but it happens to be in somewhat of a boundaried way, where you could oftentimes say, some of my closest friends, I don't hear about the challenges that they're facing sometimes until after they've occurred, because they don't want me to worry about them dealing with their challenges. But when you go to your middle circle, where people care about you, but it's like, I've lost my work and I'm nervous about my work. And then the people can say, oh, that's so hard. I too am dealing with that struggle. And you don't have that inner circle parental, like, well, what are you going to do? You got to figure this out. You have to solve this right away. You got to, we got to get on this. How can I help you? And so the middle circle sometimes has boundaries that allow you to be vulnerable in ways that you can't be with your inner circle. And the other big component is that the inner circle is sometimes the place where you're having the conflict and you need the care and support from a wider community to help you as you navigate life in the inner circle. So middle circle is really just an idea of that removes the doctrinal, dogmatic stuff of church and says, it's important that we have this type of community in our lives. And the question that then remains is, well, then how will we gather if we're not going to gather because we praise Martin Luther's nailing the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg doors 500 years ago, and we continue to celebrate the theological principle of by faith through grace, and we like the cultural connections that come with Lutheran identity or what have you. So the question was, what will make us be bonded together or have some sort of unified connection if it wasn't going to be a creed, the Nicene Creed?
So what bonded you together?
I'm glad you asked. So we thought a lot about it, and at the time it was pretty radical to think about. But what we realized is that we could create a shared set of values. And what's interesting is that it doesn't seem all that unique now. I think the church itself realizes the Lutheran sphere, even the ELCA, the way that they're talking about what it means to be Lutheran is, I think that it's okay to have values that you care about be a part of that identity. But even just a little bit ago, it seemed like there was kind of a push within the church to just be like, this is why the Lutheran articulation of Christian faith is distinct and important. And it's almost kind of a doubling down on Lutheranism. But the challenge is that, like, that's even if it is valuable, there's just going to be an audience of people, actually the majority of people, who are going to say, that's great, but I'm not connected to that. I am connected to love of the neighbor. I can connect around that. And then someone say, oh, we love the neighbor, How about personal transformation and working within? Well, we care about that too. In fact, we come and we to reflect and think about their identity and how they're trying to be at work in the world as a unique person. So what we decided was, let's claim 3 core values that we all would feel united by. Obviously, there's a lot of values that we could have picked. And we did we sent out a survey to hundreds of people, asking them to prioritize the values that mattered most to them. And then we synthesized the data, and then we ended up deciding what would we stand for in our unique identity as a community. And we decided on curiosity as the first one, which helps to claim that we're coming wanting to be curious with one another in a middle circle type of relationship. I want to be changed by you, and I hope that that I can also be a change agent for you as we learn about each other and how what matters to us impacts this community. The second was creativity. And the third one is social good. Or sorry, not creativity, community. Curiosity, community, and social good. And the community one is, to some extent now, it's kind of like, well, who doesn't want to be a part of community? But the idea is how we were forming community was distinct, that we could gather community around people's shared interest in improv. One of Middle Circle's longstanding groups has been around people gathering for improv, and then not just for fun, but also to focus on what does it mean to use the philosophical idea of wanting to say yes to your neighbor. You know, in improv, the way that improv works well is when you're yearning for both you and the person you're interacting with to succeed in your engagement with each other. And they call that yes and. And so what does it mean if we try to think that way or use that principle every day in our lives, at home, or willing, in a way? It's kind of like, for me as a Christian Lutheran, I would say, like, it's a form of how you bring about the kingdom of God, by saying you will it to come. We dream of that vision of heaven that we think of as the way the world could be, and we want to help bring that on earth. And you can do that by saying yes, I want to have that, I want to make that happen. This forum is an example of that, trying to say yes to, I want to challenge myself to think about how bias is held within me and within our church, and how I can challenge myself to release that bias. So curiosity, community, and social good. And it's interesting that social good is one of probably the primary aspects of Middle Circle's life, wanting to be involved in making the world a better place. And you would think that probably is one of the core values of our church too. But for certain reasons, the connection to the church and to social good has somewhat disconnected, and people feel like they don't necessarily, that churches aren't the place to go if you want to engage in social good.
Well, and I would say, like, so at Grace, our mission is to love God, love others, and serve the world, which seems like a very similar, like, we have a particular Lutheran lens, and people who orient themselves within a Sunday service as one of the ways that they kind of are forming their compass of their faith, which is, I think, the work that you all do, is like reorienting your compass. That curiosity is the way that your folk are orienting themselves in faith. There are some congregations from whom, and you know where I stand on this, so you just know that I'm lifting up questions that I think will be helpful for other folk. But like, one of the things I used to hear a lot when I spent 12 years working with the homeless is, why don't those people ever come to church? We don't want people who just come to feed the homeless and then don't do anything else. And I think there is a reason that people are wanting to volunteer in a faithful community, and they aren't choosing a different community to volunteer in. So from my perspective, they are fully a part of that congregation's life, even if they don't ever choose to go to a Sunday service. But can you speak a little bit about how the ways, maybe this would be the way to say it, is I kind of see, like in the metaphor of your community being a circle, there are times in which middle circle overlaps other circles, like times in which you connect with First United and now with the Lutheran church that you're at. And right, so there are ways in which you sometimes overlap and connect with other faith communities, but also kind of maintain this space that is kind of an open welcome to people who don't necessarily fit those other spaces. It's like you've built a creative, faithful home for all the people who are interested in connecting with church community. Mm-hmm. But for some reason or another, the Sunday worship part for some people is triggering.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and you know, we could go down a rabbit hole on this, but you know, one question is, was Jesus trying to launch a Christianity, or was Jesus trying to help reform Judaism and help? You know, if you read the Gospels, a lot of it is about how, at the time, Jewish leaders were really focused on conforming to the law, and that people, it was kind of like they forgot about the people. And Jesus spent a lot of time saying, like, these are God's people, and I love them. I'm gonna spend time with them. And if you don't want to be associated with them because they're not conforming to the laws that you believe people need to conform with to be right with God, you know, I'm gonna differ with that. And you think of Luther, and we just were celebrating the Reformation last Sunday, and was Luther trying to start Lutheranism, or was he trying to help bring awareness to the church and how the church was going astray when it came to the whole point of it all? And I think Lutheran scholars would say that Luther's intent was never to, in the beginning, was never to start a whole Reformed church. It was to help reform the Catholic Church in its time. And I think middle circle, not that it really can be compared directly, but as a little micro community experience within the wider church, there would have been an option for us to be just a separate thing, you know, to not be part of the church. But me, and as someone who's involved in it as a leader, along with the people who gathered to help form it, all said, you know, it's important to, and there was a lot of debate about this, and frankly, some people chose to not participate because of this, but to want to help the church in its own time of Reformation, and that there is a huge audience of people who no longer are participating in traditional church life, that are the children of those people who were participating in church life. You know, when I was always trying to explain middle circle to leaders in the church, bishops and stuff, I'd say, well, tell me about your kids. And they're like, oh yeah, my kids don't go to church, you know, and you know, the bishop's kids. So it's like, we're just trying to help be a place for your kids to feel like they can belong, because there's something that's not allowing them to feel like they're participants in the church today as it is. And so there's always been a core conviction of the community to be in relationship with the church. We've always had partnerships with churches, and we will continue to do so. And it's not the easy way to travel, but I think it's the way that helps to unfold into God's vision for the world, where it's not that we don't need spiritual life, even to articulate Christian life or a Lutheran identity of Christian life. But there is this thing, and this is probably where we get into the bias, where there's a disconnect, I think, between the will of a church community and the perception of the neighbor outside your door. And the way how I would reflect on this is most churches I know, at least today, oftentimes have an all are welcome sign somewhere, either inside or outside the church. We sing songs about how all are welcome. And so I always say, what do you mean by all are welcome? Because probably what it means is all are welcome to come in here if you're willing to conform to our perception of what it means to be a community. Obviously, someone who is that holds unhealthy views upon themselves or others would not be. Maybe they're welcome to be cared for by the community, but they may not be welcome to promote violent ideals within the community. So that aside, just let's say it's someone who, I'm going to be a little frank here, but let's say it's someone who's like, look, I was raised Christian and, I just think it's weird that you all are doing, communion. I don't really get the eating Jesus thing and the blood, and I just don't connect with that. Can I be welcome here? But I really don't find any connection to communion. And you'd say, well, yeah, you can belong here, but we're going to do that every Sunday. And, or maybe it's a church that doesn't give time or attention to its use of language, and they're being forced to have an identity with God and worship life that is masculine driven. And to them, it just perpetuates the subordination and subjugation of women in the church. And so they want to come into church, but they can't feel like they're actually having a connection with the holy, because the holy has to be a man or identified in masculine language, and they don't connect with the holy in that way. So I find that there's a lot of reasons for that, just a hypocrisy around churches claiming to be welcoming when they're not. And the one that's one of the hardest for us is that we are a very white church in general, and there's a desire to welcome people of color into the church. But if there's no people of color in the church, it's not very welcoming. So it obviously causes that our church to be in a place of struggle to engage in diversity and inclusion when we are not diverse or inclusive in that way already. So
yeah, I think of the work that you do as the promise that we make in baptism. This is part of the work that you do, not all of the work that you do, right? So that the promise we make in baptism is that we will love and nurture and provide a faithful space for a child who is baptized. It doesn't say as long as they continue to love Jesus, and it says we might share with them what our faith is. So one of the challenges that I always think about is like, what if every congregation in the United States had to just go 20 years back, look up every name of a child you've baptized, reconnect with them, learn their stories, and care for them where they are, not where you think they ought to be, not to bring them back to your congregation, but to truly nurture their faith, like to be godparents to these people that we baptized in the world. And I think Jack lifted up in the comments that Salt House Church is trying to lift up some of these things. Like, what would happen if we redesign church, not around the assumption that you're going to believe these things, that you're going to, like, it's not that creating new church means just figuring out if you're going to worship at 10:30 or at 8, right? It's not just figuring out the time, but it's figuring out how you can care for people who have been left behind or injured, or who, in their choice in how they want to interact with church, choose to interact in ways that that don't really fit the mold of church in years back. Is that kind of a good description of part of what you're up to?
Yeah. Yeah. I had a mentor once that, and I think this is a very common thought in the church life, but I think there's even a song called Deep and Wide. Deep and wide, deep and wide. I don't really know anything beyond that, but
there's a fountain flowing deep and wide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the issue that is faced with our engagement with the divine, which is really churches are organized ways of helping people to have engagement and relationship with the divine more than what we are, the great more, the beyond, the deep inner connection, the still small voice inside of us, or the divine, the holy in me, the saint in me, and also the sinner in me, and the shame in me, the fear in me, and then of course the divine within the relationships we have with other people and other life on our planet. And we have core religious groups, and then we have, in our country, we have these mostly post-European American versions of Christianity that may or may not fully make sense today, but they have existed, and they really did well during a certain period in our country's history. Harvey Cox, who's now retired, but he was a professor at Harvard. He wrote a book about faith. He wrote a lot of books about religion, but there's one little thing that I found has been really helpful in that we originally started in the age of faith. Christianity was in the age of faith. People having faith in something new. Christianity sprang up and grew rapidly over a course of just a couple hundred years. And that occurred, and then there was this period of belief where, so it started with faith, and we went to the age of belief, and belief was all about, well, what is it that we believe? And it had to do with the schisms, and ended really with not really ended, but it was maybe the culmination of it was with the Reformation period, where people were saying, no, you believe that thing about what the host is and the Lord's Supper, and well, that's not okay. In fact, we want to kill you now because you believe in this minute difference than me. And it really, it really showed how much these particularities came to belief. And the case that Harvey Cox makes is that we, in the latter half of the 20th century, began a new age, and that is the age of the Spirit. And I think people think, as the church goes through these dramatic changes in the American religious landscape, and we've seen already them take place in the European landscape, and then obviously an influx of people participating in at least Christian identity, but also other major religions in other parts of the world, that we're not all in the same ages at the same time. But in the U.S., what people forget is that the age of the Spirit is at work. I mean, there's beautiful movement going on, and if you look to the people, even from a political lens of how people are engaging in the injustices of the world, the needs of our planet, the need for us to be engaged in loving of ourselves and of our neighbor, people are doing that stuff. It's like the Spirit is at work, but what people want is for the Spirit to go and be in the church in that era when that's what everybody did it. And to go back to deep and wide, the challenge I think that's faced is that in the work of the Spirit, you can be wide in your perspective. But if you're only wide and you're not deep, you don't have much depth to go off of. And so I believe that there are people who, want to have engagement with the holy, the spirit, the more, the divine, faith, what have you, but are kind of just all over, just searching for it. And there's no depth. And then there are others, maybe more so how our church is identified now, is that we're kind of narrow. So we have depth. There's tremendous depth in the Lutheran expression of Christian faith. It's extremely deep and powerful and can change you and make your life filled with meaning and purpose. But it can sometimes be a narrow expression, and that it's like, well, we want you to do it this way with us. And so I dream of a church that could be both deep and wide, where there's an understanding of the many ways that we can be involved in meaning making in life, but also trying to promote a deep form of that. And perhaps one way to do that would be that you kind of do both at the same time. And I dream of our congregations being known in our communities as places of welcome for people who are on that spectrum of wideness. And maybe it is that they're going to find the meaning in engaging in the congregation's homelessness initiatives. In fact, maybe they're on the leadership group of it, or they're working every weekend in the community garden. And that is where their depth is coming, is in those engagements. And then there's others who get it when they chant the psalm on Sunday. And I kind of think that we are in a little bit of a tricky situation in figuring out how to promote that in children's education and spiritual development or spiritual formation. I have a child. I'm the proud father of a 11-month-old named Soren, named after Kierkegaard. And I'm now trying to learn the songs, the nursery songs to sing. And it's fascinating. You either have to sing about London bridges falling down, or Jesus loves me, this I know. And if I don't believe it, then, something, if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, kind of stuff. Or you got to sing about bananas and beluga whales. And I love those songs, but where's the music for the values driven, deep and wide theological thinking? So I've been on this journey trying to learn about beautiful ways of, even just for my own child, how can I raise them to explore, wonder, learn about faith life and church life, but to do so in a way where I'm not saying, and I want you to do it exactly in this very narrow way. And I think that's why a lot of people have left the church, is that it was so narrow. Once people realized that they wanted more broadness to their spiritual perspective, the church has not been able to broaden its perspective to make them feel like they can still be participants. So they've just left.
Well, I look forward to your new CD of children's lullabies that are better. But also I think there are pockets of places, and it tends to be experimental places, at least in the church's eyes, that are doing some of this work. But I've also seen it in grand cathedrals. There's a week when they unscrew all the pews because they're going to polish the floor or whatever fancy thing they're going to do. And during that week that they unscrew the pews, they do all this experimental stuff that they're limited and cannot do when the pews are screwed into the ground. So at Grace Cathedral, they have this beautiful 2 weeks of art extravaganza where they have light shows and ballet dancing and yoga everywhere. And even in Trondheim, Norway, they have the St. Olaf Festival. They unscrew all the pews And there's, yoga everywhere and opera singers and all of this stuff that is intergenerational, everyone worshiping together. You can go to whichever parts make your deepness happen and come together for worship or not, but you kind of plug into the parts that work for you, and there's no guilt or shame for not plugging into the parts that don't work for you. But then they polish the floor and they screw all the pews back in, right? And things go back to normal until it's that like festival, unusual time. And so I guess my wondering for you is, how can we help congregations make that time a little longer, right? Like maybe it lasts a month next time and then 2 months. Like how can we help people? Because unscrewing the pews, it creates some conflict. We put them on wheels, that helped a little, but still it's a problem, right? But do you have any ideas about how we can decrease the bias against folk who are finding the deepness of their faith outside of a traditional Sunday service, and who would be happy to join us in our sanctuaries if they were maybe adjusted architecturally slightly to kind of make space for where they find their connections? Yeah. Do you have any insights into that? Because you would solve all of the problems of the church world if you could.
Well, thank you. Yeah. The first reaction to that is theological. And so I think I'm speaking now to people who would identify in some way to following Jesus' way, and believe in some form or fashion that, at least for me, that love has a big role to play in life's fullness. So we begin with bias itself. This is kind of how we look at ourselves as people in the church, and then those outside of the church. And it would be, can you develop a theological, spiritual, faith-based conviction in the same way that Luther had a conviction that his conscience was bound to? And could you have one yourself that people are no better when they are inside your church? That they are beloved, good, holy, just, awesome people outside of the church. And to me, if you live into the abundance of grace, that God loves all, God is love. Wherever love abides, God abides. And so whether or not that love is happening inside the church building or not, the Spirit is at work, God is at work. And what a lovely thing to be involved in helping to be an agent of that love. And so to me, like, that is what Jesus, this is me as a theologian, but that is what I believe Jesus was trying to do in his life. And we have a documentation of that, a form of that. But Jesus was trying to just be loving to people. Didn't matter if they were Jew or Gentile or Samaritan. Jesus was just trying to be loving, and especially loving to those who are marginalized, disenfranchised by the systems of power. So if our church, it holds power in some form or fashion, just releasing yourself of the sense that you need to somehow do something to fix the church, or to bring it back to the golden age or something. Just let that all go, and instead just live your faith active in love. Love mercy, act justly, live with kindness. And I believe, at least, if we did that, you would find that our churches would shift and be molded into taking little steps towards the way that God dreams for our lives to be in community. it's kind of saying it's the yes and of grace, of God's grace. Will you say yes to God's grace? Like, you don't have to do anything to, God already is at work and loves everybody. So what are you going to do now to live that out? So that's my first, is just, it kind of, another way to look at it for me is, I don't look up to the richest person or the best looking person. The people that I admire are the people who are truly authentic. That you can just feel like who they are is who you see. And to me, many of the great spiritual leaders of history, I feel like we're just finding a way to be in love with life, knowing that life is also filled with tremendous suffering, and they will spend their whole life trying to help cease that suffering, but still find life to be beautiful. And it's a very tough challenge. But I admire people like that, and I want to struggle with trying to live that way too. And I think if our church claimed that identity of we just want to be loving people, and this is a place where we gather to work on that together, I think that you'd find that naturally people would want to be there too with you, because it's a loving place. So that's my first very theological, philosophical answer. The more tangible thing would be to, if you're looking for like things to put in your meeting minutes of how you can help, I think it would be much more of a human-centered design thinking process, or what others might call a community organizing process of responding to needs in the community. So instead of deciding what you think people should want, you go out and you listen to what people want and need, and then you see how you can help meet that need in the community. And it could even be just someone in the neighborhood and just say, hey, I'm part of this church and I'm just curious, how are you, and what would you hope a place like this is involved in here that matters to you? And then maybe they'd say, well, obviously right now in these times, it's difficult to think about stuff happening in the church itself. We're thinking in different ways, but in a different era, maybe it's some way for families to be able to connect, and helping people organize for family life. Or maybe it's helping to meet something that's generationally focused on connecting people of different generations together. Or maybe it's creating a listening post for how the community can look at their unhoused neighbors in a way that is living into the core values of caring about people, and the struggle of disassociating homeless with humanity because they don't know what to do, so they just walk past and but I think Megan, you mentioned some really creative ideas, and I think that those are great ideas, and yes to all of those. And then in addition, I think that if a church could truly just believe that that a person doesn't need to conform to the church's traditional identity for them to belong, that is releasing the bias. It's a practice to release the bias, and I think that to me is the core thing that would change. And ministerially, my pastoral identity is rooted in chaplain pedagogy, or Megan, you've even used these words, but I'm a white man who was raised in a suburban culture, who is trying openly to work through my identity and wants to be a participant in the shared power reality of our day. And I want to do that authentically, vulnerably, and I can't meet every need. I don't know how to tend to every need, but I can just offer what it is that I can and try to be loving with those who are given into my care or who I am gifted with being in relationship with. And I think just trying to be loving to others is kind of a pastoral task. And that would mean that the people who are part of our community and are adamantly atheist know that I care about them. And I'm not trying to make them not atheist. I just care about them, and they are cared for, and we are in community together, and we love each other. And what would it be like to live in that way towards others? So that's a chaplaincy form of care. You know, you may walk into the room of someone who is taking their last breaths and comes from a very different religious background. And the idea is, well, how can I try to be a loving presence with what I have the ability to do? And to know that what I shouldn't do is project what I think that you should want onto you. And that's something that I think Lutherans are a little stuck in doing. And I hope that I believe the age of the Spirit is at work in the ELCA. And I think that we'll find slowly now the need for change. One thing I think would be great is we oftentimes will hear a sermon on justice or something. And then the next thing we do is we sing a hymn that is just reverting completely back to the old norms. And I think it would be lovely if we spent time thinking about all the facets of our faith life and worship life and community life and the ways that the bias is held. People kind of almost just give excuses to tradition or something and don't acknowledge the bias that we hold within our church. But part of it is that we put these books together. The one we have right now is cranberry, not red, but it used to be green, and then before that, I think it was red again. And but
I think it's going to be purple soon. They're working on a new one.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. And I hope that the purple one is filled with some different language. But that we're not willing to say like, well, it's found in this book, so it's okay as it is. And it's like, well, it's not okay for a lot of people. That there's every setting in here is just praising the he God. And if that's a barrier for entry right off the bat, what does that say for our church that we don't acknowledge and change that? So,
well, there's so many parables that are kind of Jesus saying what you're saying, like, the Good Samaritan being the faithful person, not necessarily the rabbi, right? And take the anti-Semitism out of it, but this idea that the ones that you expect to be faithful aren't necessarily faithful. There's one of my favorites is a moment where the disciples are super mad because they don't know how to like get rid of demons anymore. They've like lost their demon getting rid of powers. But other people who don't even follow Jesus, they're just claiming they follow Jesus and they're able to like get rid of demons. And Jesus is like, who cares? Like, stop caring who is a part of our group and who's not a part of our group. If they're like loving people in the world, like you're going to have to get used to other people being a part of this. And I wonder if a part of the barrier for us goes back to that ancient Greek translation in our Bible about the difference between the word the and it's the same word in Greek, right? The and the person who translates the Bible gets to figure it out. So when it says Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light, it also means Jesus is a way, a truth, and a light. but it makes 1,000 years of difference of who is welcome into your faithful space, who's following Jesus. Are you following the Jesus? Or are you following right? Are you following a way or the way with a capital T? And so I think there's just so much richness in seeing, I kind of see it as like a church accordion, right? Like we got really used to the accordion being pressed together and not knowing there's all these different flaps and folds in between that people could express their faithfulness in. And you might be the crease over here, and Salt House is the crease over here, and right, all these things that we're doing kind of are making the same strange cacophonous accordion music, right? It's got to be kind of an off instrument, right? But I just think there's something beautiful about having diversity. And I know that there is a fear and a backlash that comes from seeing all of the exploration and the freedom that happened in the 60s and the 70s. Like there was this time of beautiful freedom and expansion, and it was followed by this very tight do it this way or else that came afterwards. And so I know that as people see communities that are kind of trying to open back up again, there can sometimes be this backlash fear of like, don't go too far or things will get bad again. Do you have ways that you navigate conversations like that when people are wanting to kind of put the brakes on your community or on folk who are beyond Sunday service folk? What's your response to that? Do you have a good way to do it? I feel like you probably at least have had to say it a couple times.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've learned, it took a while, but it's so much better to have people in the community speak for themselves than to speak on their behalf, because you then people realize that like, oh, here you are, and I like you, and I know this guy Anders, and I know he's a heretical guy, and he's nice and everything, but he ends up like agitating, and it's just like, can you just do it the normal way, please? And then you just say, well, here's someone that has found a place of connection, and tell them what you believe, or like what you think. And it's interesting because typically you find that they agree on everything, but one or two things about, and frankly, I'm not even sure if the churchy people believe those things too. They just they're not used to not having the invitation to wonder what they believe. Most of our, I actually really think that that there's a place, for Christianity, in the way that people have found richness of meaning in other religious, experiences. It might just need some time for people to kind of, like a generation to not be involved in things, to then want something to believe in and belong to. And hopefully in that little break, the work that's been needed to be done to repair the accordion and to get it all tuned up will occur, so that people can come back like, this is beautiful, And I think a lot of it is also the American fundamental form of Christianity, the in and out version, is this is just me speaking personally here, but I think it's very damaging to people. The inclusive, exclusive, if you're not, even just the idea of thinking of God, the God who is creator of this beautiful expanding universe that's existing over billions of years, and that would somehow have in the plan or workup that at the end it's going to be a little counting, and then like a large portion of what I've created that I called good is actually not good, and I'm going to smite it off into a abyss, and then we'll have this little group of like people who are loving and accepted. And I, if that's the way it is, that's terrible. I mean, can you imagine people, like humans, thinking that way about people? And we kind of are doing that right now, and it's been it's just incited violence and you know uh, peace and love and goodness and beauty and joy and forgiveness. Uh, those are of God, um, and what Christianity offers is a distinct way to fully engage in God's character, because we uniquely believe that God um, was and is among us in something that is tangible to us, and someone who was like us, took the form of us. And when you look to that God, was Jesus, who became Christ, doing this, in and out, and or was it about loving people, and then Jesus loved them, and then who Jesus especially gave that loving attention to, and um, whether or not it all happened exactly how it was written, or the beauty of that explaining to us through engagement with scripture um, and other ways of engaging the Spirit to be in relationship with God through this way, this Christian way, to me is extremely life-giving. But I had to unlearn a lot of ways of Christianity that were taught to me in Lutheran church, to be in communion with God through Jesus. And so to me, when people ask me if I were talking to other spiritual Christian type folk, is really a question about what is Christianity? What is this about? What are we doing? And I find oftentimes the atheist friend, um, maybe we both believe life is a gift. I happen to think that it's a gift from God. They think it's just a random happenstance that it happened to be here. And so, in a core Lutheran idea, it's like it's a gift, and by the grace of God, I'm here. So why not? Therefore, should I not joyfully go and live my life to the fullest, serving the neighbor? I could say that, and I'm doing that through the love of Christ. And then my atheist friend will say, like, well, I happen to be here, and like I better make the most of it, and I should probably help other people at the same time too. And so you actually find that we hold a lot in common. I probably have more in common than someone who's like, no, God, God's testing you right now, and if you don't do the right things, and make sure that you're excluding the people who are doing the wrong things, you're going to be out, and you don't care about the people who are in. And make sure you make that distinction nice and clear, and protect what you have, because God's only going to take a few. And I don't. When I read the Gospels, when I look at Jesus, I don't understand that story. I don't read that story. So I think you just say, I'm trying to follow Jesus, and this is just a way to do it. And I think there are a lot of ways to do it authentically.
So will you speak to then, because I think your answer is that Jesus and love of Jesus exists beyond congregational walls, but there's a lot of people who say the church is dying, and when they say that, they mean people in like the pews behind you on a Sunday morning. What do you think about this idea that church is dying?
Yeah. Well, the age of belief may be ending, but the age of the Spirit is just beginning. And so I kind of invite people to to imagine what would it mean to be a participant, an early adopter, or an encourager for the age of the Spirit. And I think some of that would begin with, like, when you are out on the street, to even go through the practice of, like, everybody here is made in God's image, and people are raised to believe things and have had, life experiences, and so we're not all on the same page, but we are all made in God's image. And what might it be like for me to think of the Spirit at work in all of us, or at least encouraging people to be open to God as Spirit moving and working in and among us and through us. So there's that. And then the other thing that I find helpful sometimes is to use the metaphor of trees. And, like, redwood trees are beautiful. They live a long time, but they won't live forever. And they take up a lot of space. And when one of these beautiful trees naturally falls, we won't use, like, the metaphor of being cut down, but there's a big opening in the sky now, that where there once was no room for something else to grow because that tree was taking up all that sunlight. So now this new sun is there, and life on the ground right then and there there's a lot of stuff stirring, and to some extent there's competition to see what's going to take the place of what is going to grow there now. And I think that it's helpful to think about, if things are changing and if the church is dying, we should be offering one, good palliative comfort care, just like you would do in chaplaincy. You want to help someone die well and with dignity, if that is happening. And two, that it's okay that things die, and that just because something dies doesn't mean that new life isn't also involved in the process. Right now in this conversation, many people have died and many people have been born, and that's a part of the process. But they're, it's not easy if you've grew up with the yellow taxi cabs or with those cute London cabs, that the black cars, to see, like, well, we're not, I want it to stay that way, but things are changing. And I don't know if it's better, but it's changing. And so you should grieve the change if you need to, but it's just kind of changes occurring. And Christianity has been changing all the time. We just we start to have a memory of what we think it means for Christianity to be in the world, or for the church to be active in the world. And maybe it's kind of like letting the secret out. If there's this great gift that the church has kind of been keeping within, like, the Spirit has it, it's at work in the world, it's okay for it to be at work in the world. What I do hope is that we don't lose the church as, like, a if every little church on the corner turned into just
you can say Starbucks.
I would feel like there's been a loss, because there should be places that are set aside for the spiritual life, and I believe should not be just businesses. One fear I have, just as an aside, is the kind of the spirituality becoming like a capitalistic, business oriented space, that you pay, you're paying for your well-being, and that concerns me, because it should be free.
It's the most Lutheran thing you've said the whole day.
Love of God is free. So
yeah. Well, when you were speaking, it
What's
reminded
that?
me
I missed
of,
you there. What?
oh, I said it's the most Lutheran thing you said all day to say that no one should have to pay to go to a spiritual place. But your story reminded me of a time I was having coffee with a gentleman who we both do chaplaincy care to folk out in the community. So if someone dies tragically, we'll go and provide them with grief support. And he's Catholic, and he said, "Pastor, I've got your Christmas sermon for you," which is always when a pastor leans in, because you need a couple Christmas sermons if you have to do more than one service. And he said, "How did Martin Luther come up with the idea for the Christmas tree?" And I thought for sure this was going to be a joke. And he goes, "Well, there's two ideas." He said, "Martin Luther standing out in the middle of the forest, praying deeply to God, doing his nighttime ritual. He looked up at the magnificent sky and he saw it through the trees and he thought, man, God is so powerful. The whole universe is part of God's creation. I want to bring that back to my home and remember that always." And so he cut down the tree and he put the lights up, and that's how the Christmas tree happened. He said the other story is Martin Luther was walking home. He had the worst day at church. He was trying to get home. It was snowing so bad he couldn't see where he was going. He walks smack into a tree, falls over, breaks the tree. It lands on his head. He's looking up at the sky. He's pissed off. And the twinkling lights through the evergreen reminded him, even in the midst of your own stupidity, God shows up, right? And he drags the tree back because he had knocked it over. And then he tells this beautiful story on Christmas Day, because pastors always like leave out the part of their own stupidity, and it just becomes this beautiful moment of God. And he goes, "Do you know which one is true?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "It doesn't matter."
Nice.
Right? Whether we're stumbling into our faith because creation gets in our way and we're not looking for it, or whether or not you're intentionally trying to be contemplative, does not matter. Like how faith finds you, what instruments you use, what theological books or hymnals you use is less important than the fact that God shows up for you rather than your attempt to show up for God. And so I think if that beautiful Christmas sermon can show up by having coffee with a person who believes radically different from me, right, then how much are we missing when we're not able to be in community with folk kind of in these in-between spaces? So I think that's what you're up to. I'm excited that you took this time to spend with us, because I think it's really lovely to think about ways that we can perhaps open our buildings in a less biased way than when we closed them, right? So how can we be more intentional as we begin to embody our spaces again? And so I'm just delighted that you joined us. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah.
I'm very appreciative of this series that you've been doing, and I think it's helpful for people to be thinking about the various biases that we hold, and this one I think, though maybe it's not the one that we focus on, because we do have the behemoth of our of some other primarily I think racial bias that we need to work through. I think they're interconnected, and I suppose if my little final thing to say would be just around this authenticity thing, that if you walk out into the world and you do so proud of your faith and your church and the way that you're trying to make change, to be a follower of Jesus, I think that sense of authenticity is probably what, to me, someone outside of the church would be drawn to. It's like, wow, you seem to be someone who is in it, in life, in the world, engaged. And I think that to me might be something that we as a church should do, instead of like, I'm a Lutheran and we're really great, you should come in here. And it would be focused on an authenticity rather than trying to push or shove something upon people that they don't want, but they would love to be in relationship with you because they like you. So,
yeah. And I would say two of our most committed church members at my congregation knew me as someone who volunteered well at other stuff. They didn't know I was a pastor. And then somewhere someone used my title and they went, wait, that person's a pastor? I could go to that pastor because I know this to be someone who's authentic and justice centered, and doesn't have to be the goal, but it is a path. A path.
amen.
Take care, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you
Thank
again
you.
next week.
Yep.
Bye.
Peace.